My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I'm 68 years old, and a couple of months ago, my only daughter stood up in a courtroom and told a judge I was too far gone to be trusted with my own checkbook. She had a doctor's report. She had a lawyer in a gray suit. She had that soft, pitying little smile she's been practicing on me for 2 years. What she didn't have, what she never wants to consider, was that I spent 30 years catching people exactly like her. People who believe numbers can't talk, they can. And that afternoon, in front of God and a probate judge, mine started screaming. Before I take you back to the beginning, I want to say one thing. If you're listening from somewhere far away, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this has traveled. And please, stay with me until the end. Because what my daughter did to me is only half the story. What I did back is the other half, and I need you to understand that I didn't do it out of spite. I did it because I refused to disappear. Let me start in that courtroom, since that's where she thought it was over. It was a Tuesday in late April, the kind of gray Ohio morning where the sky can't decide if it's going to rain. Probate court, third floor of the Franklin County complex, a room that smelled like floor wax and old coffee. I sat in a wooden chair at a table on the left side. They sit the proposed ward, that's the legal term for me, ward, like I'm something that washed up on a beach, right where everyone can look at you and decide if you can still tie your own shoes. My daughter Brooke sat at the other table with her attorney. She wore a cream blazer she'd bought specifically, I'm sure, to look responsible. She had a folder. She kept touching it, like a talisman. And when the hearing started, her lawyer, a smooth man named Prescott with reading glasses he didn't need, stood up and said, in this gentle, regretful voice, that it brought his client no joy to be here, that she only wanted what was best for her mother. That sadly, the evidence showed Mrs. Whitfield was no longer able to manage her own affairs. Brooke nodded along like it hurt her. She even dabbed her eye once. I have to give it to her. She'd gotten good at the crying. When she was 9, she used to do it to get out of cleaning her room, this little hitch in her breath, and Raymond would melt every single time. I'd watch from the doorway and think, that girl is going to be dangerous someday. I was right. I just had the target wrong. I always assumed the danger would point out at the world. I never once imagined it would turn around and point at me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand why I sat in that chair without my heart racing, why I let them think they'd won, you have to go back 2 springs to when I lost Raymond. My husband died in April of 2024. Pancreatic cancer, the kind that doesn't knock before it comes in. One day he was fixing the gate latch in the backyard, and 4 months later I was holding a cup to his lips because he couldn't lift his own arm. 38 years of marriage, and at the end I could carry the whole man in my 2 hands. And he weighed less than the toolbox he used to swing around like nothing. We bought our house on Hawthorne Street in 1990, Maple Grove, a quiet suburb on the north edge of Columbus, the kind of street where everybody knows whose dog got out and whose kid made the honor roll. We paid $89,000 for that house, and we thought we'd robbed a bank. It was a wreck. The previous owners had wallpapered the kitchen in this mustard yellow floral that gave me a headache just walking past it. Raymond and I spent the early years of our marriage on our knees in that place, sanding floors, rewiring the garage, scraping that god-awful wallpaper with putty knives until our wrists ached. There's a spot on the dining room baseboard where he hammered his own thumb and said a word in front of 3-year-old Brooke that we both pretended she didn't repeat at preschool the next week. That house was us. Every dent in it was a memory, and when Brooke looked at it after her father died, I watched her stop seeing a home and start seeing an asset. Here's the part she never bothered to learn about me, because by the time she was old enough to ask, she'd already decided I was just mom, soft furniture in the background of her life. For 30 years, I was a forensic accountant. That's the polite term. The real job is this. I found money that people hid, and I proved how they hid it. I worked for a state agency, then for a firm that got hired when a company's books didn't add up, or an estate started leaking cash that nobody could explain. I sat across from men in better suits than I ever owned, and I watched their faces go gray when I slid a single page across the table and tapped one number on it. I learned that fraud isn't loud, it's quiet, it's patient. It hides inside the boring stuff, the routine transfers, the rounding, the line item you'd never look at twice. The decimal point that's one place to the left of where it ought to be. I learned how to wait. I learned how to watch. And most of all, I learned that the truth doesn't argue. It just sits there in the record until somebody finally reads it out loud. I want you to hold on to that because it's the whole story now. The cracks didn't show up all at once. That's not how these things go. It started about 6 weeks after the funeral, and it started so small that I talked myself out of it a dozen times. The first time we were in the kitchen, my kitchen, the one I'd cooked 30 Thanksgivings in, I'd mentioned, just in passing, that I'd been pricing costumes of Raymond's headstone, and Brooke looked up from her phone said, God, Mom, do we have to do the morbid thing right now? I let it go. Grief makes people sharp. A week later, she was opening my cabinets the way she does, helping herself, and she said, light, like a joke, when this place is mine, the first thing I'm doing is gutting this kitchen, giving 1995. Then she laughed and bumped my shoulder like we were in on it together. When this place is mine. Not if I ever inherit. When? Like the deed was already halfway into her name, and I was a tenant whose lease was running out. I bit my tongue. I'm good at biting my tongue. 30 years in conference rooms, full of men who took credit for my work, taught me that you don't waste a reaction. You save it, you file it. But I started very quietly to file. Let me tell you about my grandson because he's the reason any of this matters. Caleb is 16, Brooke's boy. He's a tall, quiet kid with his grandfather's hands and a brain that runs on patterns. The type who'd rather build a spreadsheet than make small talk. He's been coming over to my house on weekends since he was little, and after Raymond died, he started coming more. I think it was the quiet. His house had stopped being quiet. We had this thing, Caleb and me, stat tracking. It started as a joke. During one of his football seasons, we built a little spreadsheet to track his team's stats, and he got so into it that we never stopped. By that fall, we were tracking everything. Gas prices at the 3 stations near the highway, how many days it rained, the high score in some phone game he played. It was nonsense mostly, but it was our nonsense, and it taught that kid something I'm proud of. He learned to trust data over noise. He learned that what people say and what the numbers say are two different things, and when they don't match, you believe the numbers. He's also a terrible liar, and he hates being lied to. Remember that. It matters later. That first autumn after Raymond died, Caleb was at my kitchen table doing homework, and I overheard Brooke on the phone in the next room. She didn't know I could hear her. She was talking to one of her friends, that friend Danielle, and she said, lowering her voice, but not enough, honestly, Caleb spends way too much time over there. It's not healthy. She just kind of clings. I was standing at the sink with a dish towel in my hand, and I looked at the back of my grandson's head, that kid who'd asked me 20 minutes earlier if we could make banana bread the secret way, which just means he likes to be the one who mashes the bananas. And I thought, you've got it exactly backwards, Brooke. He's not clinging to me. He's escaping from you. I didn't say a word. I made the banana bread. And that night, after Caleb went home, I sat at the table and I opened a notebook to the first blank page. And at the top, I wrote the date. And under it, I wrote down, word for word, what she'd said. She just kind of clings. It was the first entry. There would be a lot more. The thing about Brooke is that she never raised her voice. She wasn't a screamer. She chipped, little flecks over and over until you looked down and realized she'd worn a groove right through you. And it kept on like that all through that next year. She borrowed my car for 2 weeks one winter, and when I finally asked about it, she blinked at me like I was the problem. You weren't using it, Mom. Relax. You weren't using it. That became her catchphrase for everything she took. My car, my time, eventually, my name. You weren't using it. By that second Christmas, the second one without Raymond, she'd started doing the other thing. The thing I didn't understand the shape of yet. We were at her house for dinner. Brooke, her husband Derek, Caleb, and me. And in the middle of the meal, Brooke turned to me and said, real casual, Mom, you okay? You seem kind of foggy lately. I hadn't been foggy. I'd been quiet. because Derek had been talking about his investments for 20 minutes and I'd rather chew glass. But she said it in front of everybody, just like you forget things now. It's okay. It happens. Derek jumped in, this big, phony warmth. Hey, no shame in it, Ellie. He's the only person on earth who calls me Ellie, and he does it because he knows I hate it. My grandma got like that. We just got to keep an eye on you, that's all. We just got to keep an eye on you. I remember setting down my fork very carefully so it wouldn't clink. Because something in the way they said it, Brooke and Derek, tag teaming, smooth as a rehearsed bit, landed wrong. It didn't sound like worry. It sounded like a script. And I'd sat across the table from enough people running a script to know the difference between a person who's scared for you and a person who's building a case. I didn't know what the case was yet, but the accountant in me sat up and started paying attention the way she does when two numbers that should match don't. Then there was the camera thing. It was this past January. I'd come into Brooke's kitchen looking for my reading glasses. I'd set them down somewhere and couldn't find them, which is a thing that happens to every human being who has ever owned reading glasses at any age. And I caught Brooke holding her phone up, the video clearly running, narrating in this low, concerned voice, just looking for her glasses again. She does this a lot now. Are you filming me? I said. She lowered the phone fast. What? No, I was texting. She was a worse liar than her son. She just had more practice. The glasses, by the way, were on top of her own refrigerator, where Caleb later told me she'd put them. I didn't have proof of that. Not then. But I tucked it away. Here's where I want to be honest with you, because I think the people who'll really feel this story are the ones who've been where I was. For months, I made excuses for her. I told myself it was grief. I told myself she was scared of losing me so soon after losing her dad, and the fear was coming out sideways as control. I told myself, she's my daughter. I raised her. There's a good person in there somewhere, and she's just buried under the worst year of her life. I wanted to believe that more than I've ever wanted to believe anything, and that wanting is exactly what almost got me. Here's the first twist, and it's the one that woke me up. It was early this past February. Caleb was over. He was at the table with his laptop, and I was making coffee. And out of nowhere, he said, not even looking up, Grandma, can I ask you something kind of weird? Always, are you like? He paused, picking the words. Careful, kid. Are you okay? Like for real. Mom keeps saying you're getting confused and stuff. She made me write down a thing last week, like a list of times you forgot something. I went very still. She had you write a list. Yeah. She said it was like, in case the doctor needed it. He finally looked up at me, and his face was doing this thing, this worried furrow that was waist too old for 16. But the stuff on it was dumb. Like Grandma asked what day it was. You asked because the calendar got knocked off the wall. I was right there. That's not being confused. That's just asking. I stood there with the coffee pot in my hand, and I felt the whole thing shift under me, the way the floor shifts when you finally see the structure behind the wallpaper. Because here's what 30 years of fraud work teaches you. You stop reacting to individual events, and you start seeing the pattern. And in that 1 second, every little thing from the last year and a half rearranged itself in front of me. The use seemed foggy at dinner. The phone held up in the kitchen. The list. Derek's, we just got to keep an eye on you. The way it was always said in front of witnesses. The way it was always written down. These weren't a daughter's clumsy worries. This was documentation. Somebody was building a file on me. The same kind of file I used to build on other people. They were creating a paper record of a confused, declining old woman, and they were doing it methodically on purpose, for a reason I hadn't named yet. I'd spent a year and a half reading it as grief. It wasn't grief, it was a case, and I had been the only person in the room not allowed to see the evidence. I want to tell you that I got angry. I didn't. Not yet. What I felt was colder and more useful than anger. I felt the thing I used to feel when I'd open a client's books and realize the discrepancy I'd been chasing wasn't a mistake. It was a fingerprint. Somebody did this. Somebody chose this. And now I get to find out exactly how. I poured the coffee. I sat down across from my grandson and I said very calmly, Caleb, I need you to do something for me. And I need you to keep it just between us, okay? Okay. If your mom ever asks you to write down something about me again, you do it. Don't fight her on it. But you tell me what she asked, and you tell me the truth of what actually happened. Can you do that? He looked at me for a long second, and then this 16-year-old kid gave me the most serious nod I've ever gotten from anybody. Bet, he said, which, for those of you over 50, means yes. That was the day I stopped being a target and started being an investigator again. The next morning, I got up at 5 the way I used to before a deposition, and I made a pot of coffee and I pulled out the notebook. But this time I didn't write down feelings. I built a timeline. This is what I did for a living. So let me tell you how it actually works, because it's not dramatic, it's just relentless. You collect everything, you date everything. You don't editorialize, you let the read do the talking. Every comment with the date and who was present, every favor Brooke had taken, every dollar. And it was the dollars that opened the door. See, I'd given Brooke access to certain things after Raymond died because I was drowning and she offered to help and I let her. That's the part I have to own. In the fog of those first months, when I couldn't look at a bill without seeing Raymond's handwriting on the old ones, Brooke sat me down at this very table and slid a document in front of me and said, "Mom, just sign this. It's a power of attorney, just for the financial stuff so I can help you handle the boring paperwork while you grieve. It's totally standard. Everybody does it. A power of attorney, a POA. It lets one person act for another on money matters. And I, Eleanor Whitfield, who had untangled 100 frauds that started with exactly this kind of document, signed it without reading it closely because I was tired and broken and she was my daughter and I wanted so badly to let someone help. I want every person listening to hear me on this. The thing that got past my guard wasn't dementia. It was grief and love. Those are the two doors fraud walks through more than any other, and they walked right through mine. So that February morning, I logged into my own accounts, and yes, I still knew all my passwords. Thank you very much, and I started doing what I used to get paid $200 an hour to do. I read the statements, line by line, month by month, and I started building a ledger of every transaction Brooke had touched. At first, it was small stuff. A $400 charge here she'd meant to put on her own card. Oops, I'll pay you back. She never did. A dinner, a salon. The kind of thing you'd let slide for your kid. I didn't let it slide. I logged it. Date, amount, vendor, her excuse if she gave one. And then, 3 weeks in, I found something that made me put my coffee down and sit back in my chair. There was a line of credit open in my name, a home equity line of credit, $40,000 borrowed against the house, opened the previous autumn. I had never applied for it. I had never signed for it. I had never heard of it. I sat there in the gray light of 5:40 in the morning, and I felt my pulse do exactly one hard knock against my ribs. And then it settled, because the professional in me took over. And the professional doesn't panic, the professional gets specific. I pulled the application. It took me 2 days and a phone call where I had to be very patient with a very young man at the bank, but I got it. And there was a signature on it, my signature, except it wasn't. I know my own signature the way you know your own handwriting in the dark. The E in Eleanor has a particular loop because of the way my grandmother taught me to write it in 1962. This signature had the loop wrong. It was close. Somebody had clearly traced or practiced, but the loop was wrong, and the W in Whitfield came down too steep, and the whole thing had the careful, hesitant pressure of a forgery, where a real signature flows, because your hand has done it 10,000 times. My daughter had forged my name, or she'd stretched that power of attorney past anything I'd agreed to. Either way, she'd reached into the one place I thought was still entirely mine, my financial identity, the thing I'd protected for other people my whole career, and she'd made it hers. This is the second twist, and this is where it stopped being a family problem and became a crime. $40,000. Against this, Raymond hammered his thumb building. And here's the part that told me everything about where her head was. She'd opened a line against the house as if she already owned it, as if the only thing standing between her and that money was a formality, as if I were already gone. I thought about the dinner where she'd said I seemed foggy, the phone held up in her kitchen, the list. And I understood, finally, what the case was for. She wasn't just trying to control me, she was clearing me off the deed in advance. I didn't cry, I'll be straight with you. I've cried plenty as my life. I cried for 4 straight days when Raymond died. I'm not a cold woman. But I didn't cry over that line of credit. Something in me had moved past it, into the cold, clean place where I do my best work. I got out a fresh sheet of paper and I started doing the thing I knew how to do better than almost anyone alive. I started tracing the money. Where had the 40,000 gone? Some of it I could see right away, payments to Derek's business accounts. A couple of large transfers I couldn't yet explain. I didn't have the full picture, but I had the thread. And once I've got the thread, I don't let go. For about 10 days, I worked in silence and I let them think nothing had changed. That's a skill, by the way, the not reacting. Brooke would call and ask if I was eating okay in that syrupy voice, and I'd say, "Yes, honey," and thank her for checking. And then I'd hang up and add the call to the log. Called, asked twice if I'd taken my pills. I don't take any pills. You see what she was doing? She was building the record in real time, planting little stones in the path, and she had no idea I was picking each one up and putting it in my pocket. And then on a Thursday at the end of February, the mailman brought the thing that ended all my excuse making for good. It was a thick envelope, official, from the Franklin County Probate Court, and inside was a notice that an application had been filed for the appointment of a guardian of the person and the estate of Eleanor Whitfield, alleged incompetent. The applicant was my daughter. For those of you in states, they call it a conservatorship, same thing. It means another person petitions a court to declare you incapable of running your own life and asks to be put legally in charge of you, your money, where you live, your medical decisions, everything. If a court grants it, you become, in the eyes of the law, a child, and the person holding the leash was the same person who'd already forged my name onto a $40,000 loan. I stood in my front hallway, the same hallway where Raymond used to hang his keys, and I read it twice. And I felt the last soft, hopeful, grieving part of me. The part that kept whispering, "She's still your little girl, she'll come around." I felt that part go quiet. Not dead, just quiet. Like a light switched off in a room I wasn't going to need anymore. Because here's what I understood standing there: she'd had to escalate. The POA wasn't enough for her, and I knew exactly why, because I'd seen this move a dozen times from the other side of the table. A power of attorney can be revoked. The second I figured out what she was doing and revoked it, which I was about to do, her access would evaporate. But a guardianship is a court order. I can't revoke a judge. Guardianship of the person would let her decide where I live, which meant she could move me out of the house for my safety and into a facility and then sell the place out from under me. And selling real estate, moving real money, doing it cleanly enough that no bank would balk, that takes the authority of a court. The POA was the test balloon. The guardianship was the real operation. She wasn't being cruel for sport. She was being thorough. She'd learned that from somebody. She'd learned it from me. I'd taught my daughter, without ever meaning to, that you don't get what you want by asking. You get it by building a case nobody can argue with. So fine. We'd see whose case was better. I put the notice down on the hall table. I picked up the phone, and I called the one person I trusted to know what to do with all of this: my old friend and former colleague, Gloria Bishop. Gloria spent her career as an expert witness in financial cases. She's testified in front of more judges than I've had birthdays. I told her, in the flat professional voice we both speak, exactly what I'd found: the POA, the line of credit, the forged signature, and now the guardianship petition. There was a long pause on the line. Then Gloria said, "Eleanor, I'm going to give you a name. Her name is Ellen Crosby. She does elder law and she does not lose." Another pause. "And honey, whatever you're feeling right now, bury it. You're going to need to be the smartest person in that courtroom, and you are. So let's go be her." That was the night I stopped grieving my daughter and started preparing for trial. Now, I could have stopped at the forgery. Legally, that was probably enough to blow up her petition and put her in serious trouble. But you don't spend 30 years following money and then stop pulling the thread 2 feet from the source. I needed to know why, not for the law, for me, because a mother needs to understand how her own child gets here. So I did what forensic accountants actually do, which isn't sexy and isn't a montage. It's public records. Anybody can pull them. You just have to know where to look. And I've known for 3 decades. I started with Derek, and what I found cracked the whole thing open. Derek's business, this contracting and property investment outfit he was always bragging about at dinner, was a corpse. There were 2 civil judgments against him in the county records, one of them for 90-some thousand dollars from a supplier he'd stiffed. There was a tax lien, and there was a dissolution filing, the paperwork you submit when a company is being wound down, dated the previous summer. The whole Investments Act he'd been performing across my dinner table for a year was a man standing on a trap door, talking loud so nobody could hear it creak. They were broke, not tighten the belt broke, drowning. The kind of debt that follows you into your sleep. And that's when the line of credit made a different kind of sense. The transfers I'd traced from that forged loan into Derek's accounts, that wasn't greed, exactly. It was a bucket bailing a sinking boat. They'd been pulling money out of my house to keep their heads above water. And when 40,000 wasn't enough, when the boat kept sinking, they needed the whole house. They needed me declared incompetent so they could sell the only real asset left in either family and use it to climb out of the hole they'd dug. I sat with that for a long time. And I'll tell you something that surprised me. I felt sorry for her. For about a minute, I did, because I could suddenly see it from inside her head. A woman my daughter's age, 39, with a kid and a husband whose whole life was collapsing, lying awake at 2 a.m. doing the same math over and over, and watching it come out the same terrible way every time. And somewhere in that math, she'd found a way to make it okay. I know she had, because I know my daughter, and Brooke can't do a single ugly thing without first convincing herself it's actually noble. I could practically hear the story she'd told herself. Mom's getting older anyway. She doesn't need that big house. It's too much for her. I'm not stealing. I'm protecting the family's assets. I'm doing what Dad would have wanted. I'm being responsible. Greed dressed up as caretaking. Desperation wearing a halo. That's the most dangerous kind of villain there is. Not the one who knows she's the villain, but the one who's genuinely cast herself as the hero of the rescue. So yes, for 1 minute, sitting at my kitchen table with the county records spread out in front of me, I grieved for the scared, cornered woman my little girl had become. And then I looked down at the photocopy of that forged signature, the wrong loop on the E, the too steep W. And I remembered that she'd ready to have a judge declare that my mind was gone, that she'd had my own grandson keeping a list of my symptoms, that she'd held a phone up in my face and narrated my decline like a nature documentary. Sympathy is a fine thing, but it's not a leash you let someone walk you to the slaughterhouse on. I folded the records up, and I went to see Ellen Crosby. Here's the thing my daughter never knew. The thing that, the whole time she was building her little case, sat under her feet like a foundation she'd never thought to check. Years ago, back when Raymond was healthy, back when we were just two careful people in our 50s making the kind of boring, responsible decisions careful people make, we set up a revocable living trust. We put the house into it. If you don't know what that is, here's the plain version. A trust is a legal box you put your property in, with rules about who controls it and who gets it. While we were both alive, we controlled it, and we could change it any time. That's the revocable part. But there's a clause that careful people put in these things. When one spouse dies, part of the trust becomes irrevocable, locked. It can't be changed, and just as importantly, it's walled off. The house wasn't technically a thing I owned outright that a guardian could seize and sell. It belonged to the trust. And the rules of that trust, written years before any of this, named our successor and named the final beneficiary. The final beneficiary was Caleb, not Brooke. Caleb. And the successor trustee, the person who'd manage that box if I couldn't, that wasn't Brooke either. Raymond and I had named Gloria, my friend, the expert witness who didn't lose. We'd done it years ago for boring reasons. Brooke was bad with money even then, and we figured a neutral, steady hand was wiser. We had no idea back then that we were building a wall my own daughter would one day run face first into, so picture it. Brooke spent the better part of 2 years, and God knows how much of Derek's last dollars, trying to get herself appointed guardian so she could control me and, through me, the house. And the entire time, the house wasn't reachable that way. Even if she'd gotten the guardianship, even if she'd controlled every decision I made, the house lived in a trust she didn't control, headed for a grandson she'd just spent months using as a witness against me, managed by a trustee who'd sooner testify against her than hand her a dime. The whole scheme was a ladder leaned against a wall that wasn't even there. She never knew. Because, and I want every parent listening to hear this, your children almost never check. Brooke had never once pulled the deed. Why would she? She assumed. She'd been assuming that house into her name since the day her father got sick. It never occurred to her that the quiet old woman in the background had already, years ago, quietly closed that door. That was the head of it. Here's the heart of it. About a week after the petition came, Caleb showed up at my house on a Wednesday, which wasn't our day. He stood in the doorway and he wouldn't quite look at me. And I knew that posture. I'd raised his mother mitzvah. That's the posture of a kid carrying something too heavy. Grandma, he said, I gotta tell you something, and you're not gonna like it. I sat him down. I made him a sandwich because that's what you do. And it came out of him in pieces. He'd overheard them. His parents, talking in the kitchen, late when they thought he was asleep. He'd heard his mom say the word guardianship, and he'd heard his dad say something about once the house sells, and he'd heard them talk about a doctor, an appointment they were setting up, where the guy already knows what we need him to say. He said it like, Caleb stopped, and his voice cracked, 16 years old and trying so hard not to cry in front of me. Like the doctor was already paid to say you're crazy, Grandma, and you're not. You're the smartest person I know. You're not confused, they just keep saying you are, over and over, and I think people are going to believe it because you don't fight back, and it's not fair. I held my grandson while he shook, and I'm not going to pretend that was a triumphant moment, because it wasn't. It was the worst moment of the whole thing. Because the cost of what my daughter was doing wasn't just landing on me. It was landing on this kid who just learned that his mother and father were liars and who was sitting in his grandmother's kitchen having to choose between them and the truth. He chose the truth. He chose me. And I have never been so proud of anybody and so heartbroken for them at the same time. Caleb, I said when he'd settled, what you just told me about the doctor, that he already knows what to say. Are you sure that's what they meant? He nodded, wiping his face with the heel of his hand. I swear, Grandma, I'm not making it up. I know you're not. I held his face for a second. Now I need you to do the hardest thing I've ever asked you. I need you to go home and act completely normal. Don't let on. Can you do that? He took a breath, and there was Raymond in his jaw right there. Yeah, he said, I can do that. And that's when I knew exactly how this was going to end. Because Brooke had just handed me the one thing I'd been missing. A bought doctor leaves a trail. And tracing trails is the only thing I've ever been better at than anybody in the room. I went to Ellen Crosby's office the next morning with a banker's box. I'm not exaggerating, an actual cardboard file box full of labeled folders, indexed with a one-page summary on top because old habits are the only kind worth keeping. Ellen is in her 50s, sharp as a paper edge, the kind of lawyer who listens more than she talks and writes down the thing you didn't think mattered. She went through my box for 2 hours, and somewhere around the line of credit, she stopped and looked at me over her glasses and said, Mrs. Whitfield, did you assemble all of this yourself? I did this for a living for 30 years, I said. I assembled cases against Fortune 500 companies. My daughter is going to find out she picked a fight in the one arena where I have a home field advantage. Ellen almost smiled. Okay, she said, then let's talk strategy. And this is the part I want to be careful and honest about, because the temptation, and a lot of people in my shoes would have felt it, was to march the forgery straight to the police and the bank and burn the whole thing down that afternoon. Forged signature, financial exploitation of an elder, identity theft. I could have called the detective the morning I found the line of credit. Ellen talked me out of the rush, and she was right. And here's the reasoning. Because it's not a plot convenience. It's how these things actually work. First, the petition was already filed. Me revoking the power of attorney, which I did that week formally in writing, with copies to the bank, stopped Brooke from doing anything new. But it didn't make the guardianship petition disappear. That train was already on the tracks. There was going to be a hearing whether I liked it or not. The only question was whether I walked into it as the confused old woman they'd described, or as something else entirely. Second, and this was Ellen's real insight, a guardianship hearing in Ohio is a contested proceeding when you contest it. I had the right to my own attorney, the right to be present, the right to present evidence and cross-examine. The court would appoint its own investigator to come interview me, a neutral party whose whole job is to assess whether I actually need a guardian. And the petition would lean heavily on an expert evaluation, a doctor's statement of my capacity. So here's what we do, Ellen said, tapping the table. Yeah. We don't tip our hand. We let them think you're not really fighting. We let them put their whole case on the record, the doctor, the testimony, all of it. And then, at the contested hearing, we take it apart in front of the judge. Every piece, the forgery, the financial exploitation, and she held up the folder where I'd started tracing the doctor's payments. If you can prove what your grandson overheard, the bought evaluation, why not just hand it to the police now? Because if we expose it all at the hearing, on the record under oath, we don't just defeat the guardianship, Ellen said. We create a clean, sworn official record of financial elder abuse and fraud on the court, and that is what a prosecutor builds a criminal case on. One proceeding, two purposes. We kill the petition and we hand the county a gift-wrapped criminal referral at the same time. One arrow, two targets. I understood it instantly because it was exactly how I used to think. You don't fire the moment you've got one fact. You wait until you've got the whole board, and then you flip it all at once in the room where it does the most damage. There was just one piece left to nail down, and it was the most important one, the doctor. His name was Dr. Holloway, a psychologist Brooke had engaged to do my capacity evaluation. And I'd seen his name before, not in a directory, in my own bank statements. Because here's the thing I'd traced, the link that closed the whole circuit. At least part of what Brooke paid Dr. Holloway, she'd drawn from that forged line of credit, the one in my name, which meant the payment to the very doctor who was going to testify that I couldn't manage my own money, was sitting right there in my records. My own forged identity had funded the man hired to declare me incompetent. You could not write a cleaner piece of irony if you tried. I'd been an accountant for 30 years, and I'd never seen the universe hand me a number that beautiful. Ellen subpoenaed Dr. Holloway's billing and engagement records, and what came back confirmed it. The payments, the timeline, and an email or two in the production that made it very clear Brooke had told him in advance what the family needed the evaluation to show. A doctor doing an honest evaluation doesn't get coached on the conclusion before he's met the patient. We had it, all of it. We just had to sit on it until the room was right. The hardest part wasn't the law, it was the waiting. For weeks, I had to keep playing the role, the quiet, maybe fading mother who wasn't really fighting back. Brooke called more, sweeter than ever, and I could hear it now for what it was. She thought she was winning, and winning made her generous. She even said on one call, "Mom, I just want you to know, whatever happens, this is all because I love you. You know that, right?" "I know, honeys," I said. And I wrote it down, said it's all because I love you. Same call she asked if I remembered my own anniversary. She really had no idea. She thought I was the cornered one. So now you're back where we started. That gray Tuesday in late April, probate court. Me in the wooden chair on the left, Brooke at her table in her responsible cream blazer, touching her folder like it could save her. I need to tell you something about that morning before any of it happened. The night before, I'd taken out the necklace Raymond gave me for our 20th anniversary, the one Brooke once called kind of clearance rack, no offense. I put it on, and I sat at my kitchen table in the dark for a while, and I talked to my husband out loud like a crazy old woman, which is the one thing in this whole story Brooke accused me of that was even close to true. I said, "Ray, our girl made a mess. I'm going to clean it up. I'm sorry it has to be like this." And I swear the house creaked the way it does, settling, and I chose to believe that was him. Then I went to bed and I slept like a stone. Because when you've done the work, you don't lie awake. The truth was already written. All I had to do the next day was read it out loud. The hearing started the way Ellen said it would. Brooke's attorney, Prescott, stood up and laid it on thick. The heartbroken daughter, the declining mother, the family's painful but necessary decision. He called it a safety issue. He used the phrase for her own good 4 times. I counted, because counting is what I do when I'm calm. And then he put on his evidence. He called Dr. Holloway. The doctor was smooth, credentialed. He sat in the witness chair and described his evaluation of me and offered his professional opinion that I showed significant cognitive decline and was unable to manage my financial affairs. He had a report. It looked very official. Brooke watched him testify with her hands folded, the picture of a daughter doing a hard, loving thing. And I sat there and let him. I let him say all of it. Because the deeper a man digs, the better the hole works when you need to bury something in it. When Prescott finished, the judge, a no-nonsense woman named Judge Ferris, who'd clearly seen every kind of family in front of her, turned to Ellen and asked if we wished to cross-examine. Ellen stood up. We do, Your Honor. And here's the rug pull. Here's twist 5. Watch how fast a case made of smoke comes apart when you light one match. Ellen walked up to Dr. Holloway, polite as Sunday, and she asked him a few easy questions first. How was he engaged for this evaluation? Who contacted him? And then gently she asked, Holloway, how were you paid for your services in this matter? He didn't see it coming, by the family, by Miss Pruitt. And do you know the source of those funds? The payment came from an account, I assume. Ellen slid a document up to him. This is your billing record, produced under subpoena, alongside Mrs. Whitfield's financial records. Can you confirm that at least one of your payments was drawn from this account here? She pointed. The room went quiet. Prescott was half out of his chair. That account, Ellen said, turning to the judge now, her voice still perfectly even, is a home equity line of credit. It was opened in Mrs. Whitfield's name, Mrs. Whitfield never applied for it and never signed for it. And we have a forensic comparison of the signature on the application, which I'd ask the court to review. Your Honor, the doctor who just testified that my client cannot manage her own finances was paid, in part, with money fraudulently taken in my client's name without her knowledge, by the very person petitioning to become her guardian. You could have heard a pin drop on carpet. And then Ellen produced the rest, the emails from the subpoenaed records, Brooke telling Dr. Holloway before he'd ever laid eyes on me what the evaluation needed to show. A capacity evaluation isn't supposed to have a predetermined conclusion. This one did, in writing from the petitioner. Dr. Holloway's smooth face had gone the exact gray I'd watched 100 executives go, across 100 conference tables over 30 years. That gray means the floor just opened. He started to qualify to walk it back. I evaluated her in good faith. The family's input was just context, but it didn't matter. The report was poisoned and everyone in that room knew it. Brooke had stopped touching her folder. She'd gone very still, and her face was just something I hadn't seen, since she was a little girl caught in a lie she couldn't talk her way out of. That frozen, scrambling look while the brain races for an exit and finds the doors all locked. Then Ellen did one more thing. She turned to the judge and said, Your Honor, with the court's permission, the proposed ward's grandson is present and wishes to be heard. He's 16, and he has direct knowledge of relevant statements made in the home. Judge Ferris looked at Caleb, who'd been sitting in the back next to Gloria, and she said kindly, Young man, do you want to tell me something? And my grandson stood up. I have replayed this moment more times than any other. This skinny 16-year-old kid, in the only button-down shirt he owns, standing up in a courtroom in front of his own mother. His voice shook on the first sentence, and then it steadied, and he told the judge plainly what he'd heard. The conversations late at night. His mom saying the doctor already knew what they needed him to say. His parents talking about once the house sells. And the list. How his mother had told him to write down times his grandmother seemed confused, and how the things on the list weren't confusion at all, they were just normal. And he'd known it was wrong, but he was scared. My grandma's not sick, he said at the end, looking right at Judge Ferris. She's the smartest person I know. They just kept saying she was because she didn't fight back. But I couldn't let them do it. It's not right. And then he sat down and he looked at the floor. And he didn't look at his mother once. Brooke made a sound, not a word, just a sound. The judge let the room be silent for a moment. Then she did exactly what I was hoping for. Now, normally I'd be the one testifying about my own capacity. But here's where the irony came all the way home. Judge Ferris asked me a few questions directly. Simple things, then not so simple. And I answered her not as a frightened old woman, but as what I am. When she asked almost as a courtesy whether I understood my own financial situation, I asked the court's permission to walk her through it, and I did. The trust, the line of credit, the signature analysis, the payment trail to the doctor. I laid out my own finances in front of that courtroom with more precision than the doctor had managed about anything, and somewhere in the middle of it, I watched Judge Ferris's mouth tilt just slightly because the absurdity had finally landed. My daughter had hauled a 30-year forensic accountant into a courtroom to prove that very woman couldn't be trusted with a checkbook. Judge Ferris denied the petition, flatly. She found no evidence whatsoever that I lacked capacity. To the contrary, she said, and I'll remember the dryness in her voice till I die, Mrs. Whitfield appears to be one of the more financially competent individuals to come before this court in some time. And then she did the second thing. She stated, on the record, that the evidence raised serious concerns of financial exploitation, forgery, and possible fraud upon the court, and she was referring the matter to the prosecutor's office for investigation. On the record, sworn, official. Exactly the gift-wrapped referral Ellen had described weeks earlier in her office. One arrow, two targets. I didn't gloat. I want you to know that. I sat in that wooden chair and I felt no triumph. I felt tired and I felt sad and I felt the particular grief of a mother who's just watched her child get exactly what her child built. I looked over at Brooke one time. She was staring at the table and her face had crumpled. And for 1 second, she wasn't the woman who'd forged my name. She was my little girl who used to cry to get out of cleaning her room. But I didn't go to her, because some things, once they're on the record, you can't take back, and neither could she. People always think the courtroom is the ending. It isn't. The courtroom is where the truth gets written down. What happens after is where you find out who everyone really was. Let me tell you how it came apart for her, because it didn't need me to lift a finger. It just needed gravity. I'll say this clearly, because I know somebody's wondering. There was no viral video of the hearing. Guardianship cases are closed and private. They're sealed precisely to protect the person being evaluated, which in this case was me. Nobody filmed Brooke's face when the doctor's testimony collapsed. There was no clip making the rounds online. That's not how it actually works, and I'd rather tell you the truth than a satisfying lie. But the truth caught up with her anyway. The criminal referral was real, and once a prosecutor opens a file on financial elder abuse and forgery, things move. The bank, once it understood the line of credit was fraudulent, came calling, and a fraud finding doesn't just vanish, it lands on your credit like a brand. Within weeks, Brooke and Derek's house of cards finished falling. The judgments against Derek, the dissolved company, the debt they'd been bailing with my money, all of it was still there. And now there was no more money to bail with, and there was a criminal investigation on top of it. Derek left. I'd half expected it, but it still told you everything about the man. The minute the scheme stopped paying and started costing, he packed a bag. Caleb told me, in a flat 16-year-old way that breaks my heart more than crying would, Dad's at a hotel. He says it's temporary. It wasn't temporary. A man like Derek doesn't stay for the hard part. He'd married Brooke when the math worked, and he unmarried her in every way but the paperwork the second it didn't. And the people, God, the people. This is the part nobody warns you about. Brooke had a whole life built on appearances, and appearances are the first thing to go. The friends who'd nodded along, Danielle and the rest, they got quiet, then they got gone. Word travels in a place like Maple Grove. Did you hear what Brooke Pruitt did to her own mother? Travels faster than anything good ever did. Derek's family, who'd never been warm to me anyway, cut Brooke off completely. I think because they could see the criminal exposure and wanted distance from it. She'd spent 2 years building a story where she was the responsible daughter, managing her declining mother. And that story died in one sealed courtroom, and there was nothing to replace it with except the truth. Brooke and Caleb ended up in a rental, a sad little 2-bedroom unit on the other side of town, beige carpet, a parking lot instead of a yard. She'd been about to inherit, in her own mind, a 4-bedroom house Raymond and I built with our hands. And she landed in a unit where the heat clanks and you can hear the neighbors. The house she'd schemed for sat exactly where it had always been, safe if in a trust, with my grandson's name as the beneficiary. She'd burned down her whole life trying to reach a thing that was never, not for one single day, within her reach. I didn't celebrate any of it. I want to be very clear about that, because this isn't a story about a woman who enjoyed her daughter's ruin. Every piece of Brooke's collapse cost me something too, because she's my child and I made her, and watching your child destroy herself is its own kind of dying, even when she's the one who lit the match. But there's a difference between forgiveness and access, and I had to learn it the hard way. Here's how I learned it. About 3 weeks after the hearing, late on a Sunday night, there was a knock at my door. It was Brooke. She'd been crying, really crying, not the practice kind, the kind that wrecks your face. She stood on my porch under the light that Raymond installed in 1994, and she said, "Mom, please, can we just talk? I don't have anywhere. I don't know what to do. I'm sorry, okay? I'm so sorry, please. And I want you to understand how much of me wanted to open that door all the way." 39 years of being her mother were standing on that porch, soaked and shaking, and asking to come in. The part of me that rocked her to sleep, that taught her to ride a bike on this very street, that cried at her wedding, that part wanted to pull her inside and make her tea and tell her it would be okay. But I thought about Caleb. I thought about the kid who'd had to stand up in a courtroom and tell the truth about his own mother, because nobody else would. I thought about that wall Raymond and I had built years ago without knowing why, the trust with our grandson's name on it. And I understood that my job now wasn't to rescue Brooke from the consequences of what she'd chosen. My job was to make sure the one innocent person in this whole story got to stand on solid ground. So I stepped out onto the porch instead of letting her in, and I held my daughter's hands, because I'm not made of stone, and I said the truest thing I've ever said to her. "Brooke, I forgive you. I do. I'm always going to love you because I don't know how not to." She started to step forward and I held her there gently. "But forgiveness and letting you back in are two different things. You tried to erase me. You used my own grandson to do it, and I can't unknow that. Some doors, once you close them, you have to leave closed, not to punish you, but to protect what's left." She cried harder. And I stood with her on that porch until she was done, because that much I owed her, the witnessing. And then she went back down the steps Raymond poured, and she got in her car and she drove back to her rental. And I closed the door. I won't lie to you. I slept better that night than I had in 2 years. Not because I'd won, because I'd finally stopped waiting for the daughter I wanted to come back, stopped pretending the woman in front of me was someone she wasn't. There's a terrible peace in that. The peace of putting down something you've been carrying so long you forgot it had weight. It's June of 2026 now. I'm telling you this from my kitchen table on Hawthorne Street, the same table where I sat at 5 in the morning this past winter and started reading the record. There's coffee going. There's a banana half mashed in a bowl because Caleb's coming over this afternoon and he likes to be the one who does it the secret way. He's here most weekends and a couple of nights a week now too. Let me be careful and honest about that, the way I've tried to be careful and honest about all of it. Brooke is still his mother, and a guardianship hearing about me didn't change his custody. That's a separate thing, a different process, and the people who love this story should know I'm not going to pretend I won my grandson in court, because I didn't, and that's not how it works. What changed is simpler and realer than a court order. His home stopped being a play I wanted to be, and mine never did, so he's here. And his mother, to her credit, And there is still some credit. She's not a monster. She's a person who did a monstrous thing. His mother doesn't fight it. Because somewhere in all of this, she figured out that the kid needed somewhere steady. And steady is the one thing I've got. So on Saturdays, we sit at this table and we open the old spreadsheet, the dumb one, the one we've been keeping for 2 years. Gas prices, rainy days. We added a column last month tracking how many different birds come to the feeder Raymond hung. Caleb says the data's low-key fire, which I've decided to take as a compliment. And sometimes doing that with the afternoon light coming in the window the way it has for 36 years, I'll look across the table at this serious, good kid who saved me. Because make no mistake, he's the one who saved me. The night he came to that door, he didn't have to come to. And I'll feel something I didn't think I'd feel again after Raymond died. I'll feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. I started this by telling you I sat in that courtroom and let them think they'd won and that I smiled. Now you know why. I smiled because they'd spent 2 years building a case to prove I was a confused, helpless old woman who didn't understand anything, and they'd somehow missed the one fact written across 30 years of my life in plain ink. I understand everything. I always did. They just never bothered to read the record.
Before you go, let me say a few words of my own. What stuck with me about Eleanor's story isn't the twist in the courtroom, and it's how easily it almost worked. How quickly a sharp, capable woman nearly got erased fending. And not by some master criminal, but by one quiet assumption that because she'd gotten older and gone quiet, she must have gone soft too. We all do it. We mistake calm for weakness and kindness for helplessness. And sometimes the people who should know us best are the ones who underestimate us the worst. Eleanor never wanted revenge. She just refused to disappear. So here's my one ask before you go. Call the older woman in your life the 10 and the quiet one in the background shouting, and ask her who she used to be before it's too late to hear it. And never assume that someone gentle has nothing left to fight with. If this story moved you, leave a comment about someone you're grateful for. I'll see you in the next one.